started. Today's topic for the coaching corner is remote instruction, and some of the things that I've learned along the way while teaching people under doing remote instruction. So I'm going to introduce myself first. Firstly, my name is Suean teaching at Zedu. I want to just remind everybody that the session's being recorded, so feel free to ask questions. But if you're a little shy, you want to ask some questions at the end that's off the air, feel free to hang on and wait until the end. I also want to just let you know the previous episodes of the Coaching Corner are recorded and are available on our website. If you look under the Resources tab and go under Coaching Corner, you can see the back catalogue there. Now, the other thing that we have got coming up in July, which is quite exciting, we're hosting our Train the Ultrasound Trainer course here in Melbourne. It's been specifically designed to break down the teaching of ultrasound, so covering all those basics of teaching and how to accelerate your learners' learning journey as they're going through that process. You can check that out on our website. It's got the whole sort of under the course's content, you can see that it's got the all the topics that we'll be covering and what we'll be looking at in that course. So tonight's episode of the Coaching Corner is all about remote teaching. COVID has forced innovations in teaching and forced everyone to sort of become much more familiar with technology and find different ways around how to do stuff. And for us during COVID, we had 340 days closed over the last 2 years. And so it did force us to pursue different options to keep us going. And so we found ourselves being asked because people could either not get to us, or we couldn't get to them, or we were stuck in our 5 kilometre zone. So even if it was just across town at our nearest hospital, we weren't able to get there. And so we have done quite a bit of online teaching, and not just this kind of format as in a webinar, but actual practical instruction in real time. And so I wanted to sort of share some of the experiences and some of the lessons that I've learned during this time about how I've needed to adapt the teaching and what sort of things we need to think about to be able to do remote instruction. This is made mostly possible because now we have a whole suite of handheld ultrasound devices. And these have been specifically designed for bedside use and for point of care areas and for resource limited settings. And so there are, projects going on where people are in Canada talking to, I've been on the phone to someone in Canada while he's scanning his heart, and I can see those pictures in real time in Melbourne. I know over in the States, there's projects going on with Lumify out of San Francisco down to South America, where they're doing instruction for registrar training. And so the advent of all these handheld systems has meant that we can bring the teaching to you in some respects. The older or the bigger cart systems, not necessarily older, but the bigger cart systems also have that ability. You can buy this EpiFan device. I think they're anywhere between 500 and 800, depending on which model you get. And essentially, this is a video grabber unit that you pop on the back of your ultrasound monitor and then connect it up to your computer and then broadcast via whichever medium, Teams or Zoom or whatever platform you're using, broadcast that to the other people. And so I wanted to sort of talk through, we've used a combination of these things during this lockdown period, and I wanted to talk through a few of the different experiences that I've had that illustrate the different strengths and weaknesses of remote instruction. So the first one I wanted to talk about was a case of lung ultrasound. So this chap that I was teaching was in a hospital that was about 7 kilometres away, and we were only allowed to drive 5 kilometres away at the time. So, and getting into the hospital at that time as a non-staff member was damn near impossible as well. And so this learner had done our online ultrasound course for lung ultrasound. And then we had a couple of sessions with him one-on-one at the bedside of a patient where he's at the hospital and I'm in my house. For this one, we used the Philips Lumify unit, and we were using the REACT software. And the REACT software is a remote education, augmentation, training, and communication training and supervision. So it's this fancy platform that allows you to broadcast, I think, 5 or 6 different video feeds. So I can drag anatomy pictures in or ultrasound pictures onto the platform if I want to illustrate a specific teaching point. And essentially the learner at the hospital is broadcasting their live ultrasound screen on whatever they're using, their phone or their tablet device. They're broadcasting to me their live screen as they're scanning. I can point out on my computer and use my cursor to show him where things are. He has a cursor at his end that he can show me where things are as well. And so the beauty of this case, it was really quite amazing. I got off the phone, I thought, oh my God, the possibilities, this is incredible. The beauty of this scan was that we had one patient in the room, and this one patient had so much pathology going on. Now, my learner wanted to jump straight to I just want to see if he's got a pleural effusion. And I said, hang on, we're doing this for teaching, and we're going to start at the top and conduct a whole lung scan and look at all the different parts of the lung scan. And as we did that, we were able to see so many pathologies just on this one poor fellow. He had some sort of malignant cancer going on. So he had malignant effusion and then a simple pleural effusion. He had B lines, he had A lines, he had lung sliding, he had bits that weren't sliding because of adhesions. So it was a fantastic case to be able to demonstrate lots of pathology on one patient, but it certainly illustrated the point that, you know, yeah, we can just get in and get to the nuts and bolts of it, but in a teaching session, we need to actually follow that teaching structure. The second group of cases that I've done several of these teaching episodes where I'm teaching early pregnancy scanning to doctors and midwives, you know, either in South Australia, Rockhampton, you know, thousands of kilometres away. The challenge with some of these, I've used both Lumify, Butterfly, and the vScan Air, all of which we've broadcast on Zoom as the easiest and simplest way to get the image across. So they're just sharing their screen like I'm doing with you now, and the screen that they're using is the live video image of the scan that they're performing in real time. Now, the challenge with first trimester stuff is that we have to be very mindful of having our patient consented for a scan for teaching purposes, and that the learner is worded up in case we find an unexpected finding. And so far we haven't, which has been fabulous, but it will happen one day. And then you have to be able to deal with that situation where you find that there's a baby with no heartbeat, and the learner and I both need to know what we're doing to communicate that and to make sure that the patient is seeing someone. So when we've set these up, we've asked that this is an additional scan. It's not a clinical scan, it's a scan for teaching purposes, and that if we're finding things, we're sending them on and referring them for formal imaging. Some of these sessions have gone fabulously well. Some of these sessions have been some of the hardest teaching that I've done. And some of that is about the learner either being spatially aware and really quick to pick up the skills, or the learner being really hard to teach insofar as, you know, they're not listening so well or not able to cope with the big cognitive demands of me talking at them trying to get pictures and dealing with the technology as well. So there's a lot going on, and depending on the learner, some sessions have gone amazingly well and some have been, let's say, a little disappointing. In one instance, our learner kind of got 3 sessions in out of a 5-session program and kind of said to me, do you know what, I think I need to do this face to face. And so once we were opened up again, they came down face to face and we had much more success. So for some people, I think it works, and for some people, it just doesn't. Part of the problem here is because we were using the Zoom platform for these ones, I didn't have the ability to be able to use my pointer on my machine at this end or my computer to be able to point out the anatomy at the other end. And so I have to describe the anatomy now. And, you know, I'm talking, oh, there's a grey splodge or a bright white line about 5 centimetres down. So it gets really quite tricky to describe what you're seeing. And if your learner is not 100% familiar with all these patterns, then you don't know that they're seeing the same thing as what you are. And so we're constantly, the ones where we missed in a big way, we're constantly missing because, you know, they think, well, I'm looking at one thing and actually they're pointing to something else. And I can't see them point to the screen and I can't see them use the cursor to point to the screen. So it made it quite challenging. Another common program that we've done is for registrars, surgical trainees or emergency medicine trainees, where we've done EFAST and AAA scanning. And again, you know, there's been 4 or 5 different episodes. Some have gone really, really well and some not so well. And some of that, I think, is just because of the technology and being remote from your learner. Some of that is because the learner hasn't done their homework. And some of that is because we've struggled to get the technology working. So there's been many different reasons why it has worked really well and why it hasn't worked so well. One of the sessions that did go really, really well, it was great because we had one of the learners who partook in a later session was the patient model. So he got to learn while we were teaching the other two, and the other two were doing taking it in turns. And so I was a bit dubious about this one because I thought we're not going to get as much hands-on time. And in fact, the 2 learners for the session actually did work really well, because as I'm explaining stuff to one learner, the other one can hear that feedback and then it swaps over and the other person has a turn while the other one's listening. The other challenge about this one was that we just had, it was a cart system, patient on the bed, and just somebody's computer and the camera on the computer set up across from the bed. The good thing about this is that that meant I could see all in one shot where the learner's hand was and what the image was displayed. The challenging thing about this is that now my image is about the size of a postage stamp and I'm trying to coach them to get better pictures based on this tiny image. And I wasn't sure whether the image representation with the bright lights in the room and how it was transmitting down the wire, whether I was able to give them the right image optimization device. So again, some really good things out of these sessions, some things that were really quite frustrating. And so the pros of doing this remote instruction is that the learner doesn't have to travel. They can use their own machine in their own workplace. And certainly during COVID, it meant that we could overcome some of those infection control issues, insofar as you're a stranger, you're not allowed in the hospital, please don't come in. So we had to find a different way around. The cons, however, are that we've had different sessions where the learner or the doctor has been interrupted with the demands of the clinical workplace. So we find when you're at our place or when we're at a course that we're putting on somewhere, you're away from those clinical demands and the clinical interruptions. So you can really 100% focus on the learning. The other challenges with the remote sessions is in the difficulty for the learner or the doctor to find patient models, and for the patient models to show up on time, and for them to be at the right stage of their pregnancy, or to even get someone to be on the bed for you. And so that's the sort of stuff at our place that we do all the time, and we have our backups and all the rest of it. But when we're relying on that one patient coming, if they haven't had their reminder call or something's happened, it can make it challenging. Some of the other cons here are that I've found that the success or failure can be quite learner dependent. And the other challenges are whether the technology is going to work. So we had a period there with one of the providers that our and so what are some of the lessons that I've learned? Preparation is key. Preparation for your learners. They need to understand what language you're using to describe the probe moves. They also need to understand the basics of how to use the machine. If you're trying to tackle all of that while doing a practical lesson on EFAST, for example, it's just too much. And so I think the session that I held today, I had kind of a aha moment insofar as I've done the classic mistake of we're just going to have our presentation that was now 5 weeks ago, and then we're just going to get straight in and start scanning without that preparatory work around here's the probe moves, and here's the language I'm going to be using, and here's the machine. Now, when you go to a face-to-face course, that's all built into the program. But unfortunately, we just had 1 2-hour session and we just had to get on to the content. Now, that can work, but if your learner hasn't done their homework, and again, today we had learners that were, they'd all been given pre-reading and there was lots of stuff that they could learn on the line, but they were, they haven't had time to review that just before today's session. And so, you inevitably have to backtrack and fill in those holes and then go through the language. So if they haven't done their preparatory homework, it can kibosh the session a little bit. Everyone has to get comfortable with the technology. Depending on what platform you're using, comfortable with the Zoom part, comfortable with how to make the ultrasound machine work and how to link up the Zoom connections. Typically what I do is ask my learner to have a 10-minute session before the day where we have our patients there, so that we can just get all those creases ironed out and make sure that everything's going to go as smoothly as it can. You can never quite tell though when you're going to have internet breakdown. Or the other thing that's been a challenge is that in some of the hospitals you can't get good Wi-Fi in the room that we're actually doing the training in. So we need to check those sort of things beforehand. In preparation, we have to go through and make sure everyone is on the same page with how I'm going to be talking about the probe movements. Now, inevitably, I'll end up giving the instructions in 3 or 4 different ways, but it's much easier if my learner is on the same page and is familiar with the words that I'm going to be using to describe those probe moves, so that when I give an instruction, they understand what I'm saying and they can just do that probe move to achieve the image that we're trying to get. So again, we have a pre-recorded lecture, if you like. It's 10 minutes long or something. We have a pre-recorded lecture that our learners are supposed to have a look at right before the training, so that they are really familiar with these terms to make the session go more smoothly. Inevitably though, even with that common lexicon and language to describe our probe moves, inevitably when you're over the line and over the wire, you have to use multiple different ways to get the idea across. Some of the challenges that I've had recently have been in describing how to hold the probe and where the cord's going to be and how to get it comfortable. And I think in real person or face-to-face teaching, you can just pick up the probe and show. Now, I had a probe here and was demonstrating it on the camera, but again, they're looking at this image that's a postage stamp, and I can never quite get the perspective and in the view right on the camera. And so that was quite surprising insofar as how hard it was then to actually put into words how to hold the probe, which is just the first step and the most basic and fundamental thing we need to be able to do in order to get an ultrasound. And if you find this like really, Suean, then I challenge you to write instructions on how to tie your shoelace. It's similar to that. It's something that we just do so instinctively that to actually now break it down and describe it in words is actually quite challenging. Now, the next thing is that when you're teaching online, you have to be able to deconstruct the skill and instruct the patient or the learner how to move the probe. If you can't recognize by looking at the picture what probe movement needs to happen, then it's just this mutual session of self-discovery where you're instructing them, here, try this, try this, try this. So it actually takes a lot of effort or concentration to be able to look at the picture and realize, okay, what's the problem with this picture? I haven't quite got the apex on. I need to rock the probe so that I can see more of the apex of the heart. Or now I need to rock it so I can see more of the aorta of the heart. So you have to be able to, at a quick glance, look at that picture, identify what's wrong, and then be able to break down those skills to instruct your learner in a stepwise fashion to be able to get to the view that you need. I mentioned just before, having a dry run with the technology is always really useful. And so that includes, going into the room where the teaching session will be held and making sure that we've got Wi-Fi connection. making sure that everyone knows how to connect to the screens properly and that everything's just going to run smoothly. And as I said, we dedicate a 5-10 minute session before the actual teaching session to run through this so that everyone's comfortable. It's also important as an instructor that you're prepared. And so I find myself with a whole array of my teaching tools here, my probe torch thing. I've got anatomical models. I have talks up in the background so that if I need to illustrate a pattern or a particular pathology where we're going to be looking for it, I've got an image pulled up ready to go that I can illustrate. So for example, the spine sign in the right upper quadrant view, I've pulled up a normal picture and an abnormal picture to show them what they're looking for so that they can then use that as an exemplar and understand what I'm actually trying to get across as they're scanning. So then they've got this visual picture in their mind straight away at the time of teaching to be able to try to get that picture and replicate the picture. I found it's really important that you set the expectations and set very clear expectations of the training. And so we're quite explicit about asking the teaching to be happening in dedicated teaching time and not as part of a clinical scan. Now, some of that is a bit of an insurance thing. I'm not here to provide a clinical diagnosis and clinical advice. It's a scan for teaching purposes. And so it's really important for us to be very clear that these remote teaching sessions are a scan for teaching purposes. It's clinical training time. It's outside of clinical time. I also want my learner to be sure to introduce me to the patient as well, and so that I can be talking to the patient, giving the patient instructions if I need. I'm not just this figurehead down the road somewhere, some random abstract voice coming out of a little box on the edge of the room. I go through each session, I go through, here's what we're going to do, here's how the session will be conducted, whilst the patient can hear as well, so that everyone's clear about what's going to happen in the session. We always get our patient models to give informed consent. So our patients need to sign a consent form that says they understand that this is a scan for teaching purposes. And if we find anything unexpected or any incidental pathological findings, that they will then go to their doctor and be referred for formal imaging to follow up on that finding. What we've found though is for the patients who are real patients, they've actually quite enjoyed the session and found it quite informative because they're learning just as much on the side as well. The other surprise I mentioned before in my different case studies, I was surprised at how well it worked with 2 people rather than 1. And I have to say, I think I almost prefer it when there's 2 people rather than 1. And the benefit is that, as I mentioned, as one person is scanning, they are completely absorbed in getting the picture and just trying to get their hand finding the right image. And the feedback I'm giving is often lost because they are just overloaded cognitively. And so the person who is watching actually hears the feedback. And then when they have their turn, they're actually faster and quicker at assimilating that information. And the other person now gets a chance to listen as well. And so it has worked really, really well. And I was surprised because I thought as a remote device with a small handheld, that it would be really important that it's just one-on-one. But an hour when it's just one-on-one over the wire or online is actually much more demanding than an hour in person. And so they get very tired very quickly as well. The other thing that I've learned personally is that anytime I've done these online remote teaching sessions, it takes a lot more out of you, a lot more concentration. I'm looking at a picture that's like the size of a postage stamp sometimes to try and see the image, or where before it'd be 1 or 2 instructions to achieve it. Now you've got to say it 6 different ways until something hits home. So it's actually much more demanding on the instructor if you are doing this remote teaching. And so now I have very wisely, I think, allowed a little bit of recovery time after a remote teaching session. If the session goes on longer than about 40 minutes, I want to have a break in the middle as well. I want the patient to have a break and a breather, the learner to have a break and a breather so they can kind of reset and take a little mental break. But it's also really important to keep the sessions quite short as well. It's much more taxing online. And so we've found that if it's a single person that I'm teaching, 45 minutes, hour tops is the best time, best sort of session. If I've got a couple of people in the group, a 2-hour session is about the limit. So it's really important though, in amongst that there are times to stop and just have a break and think about things so that they get a chance to assimilate that information. I found the online sessions to be much more learner dependent. If it goes really well, it's great. If it's going to go badly, it's even worse. So if we've got someone who struggles in person to learn ultrasound, it's just going to be impossible online. And in my years in teaching, there are some people who shouldn't do ultrasound. They just don't have the spatial awareness. That sort of situation online is just a disaster. And so one of the sessions I remember having, I think it's probably the worst 2 hours of teaching in my whole career. And we're just constantly struggling because my learner wasn't really listening because they're just madly moving this probe. I was giving instructions and then they were kind of registering those instructions about 20 seconds later, and we're looking for a heartbeat on a baby. So once they registered the instructions freeze 20 seconds after the point, we've lost the heartbeat. And then she's getting cranky at me because it's like, no, well, you've told me the wrong thing. And it's like, actually, no, I told you about 20 seconds ago that that's where you need to freeze. So we're constantly pulling and pushing and at loggerheads. And so, you know, if you haven't got the ability to kind of do two things at one time, the online situation can be very, very taxing. And the differences between your learners are exaggerated much more in that online session. The learner's previous experience can help or hinder. So I found sometimes if they've had previous experience, that means they've formed some bad habits that you've got to break down before you can build them up again. And it's harder to get across this concept of moving the probe in one direction or another. The previous experience works in a couple of ways. Either they've done lots and lots of scanning, or they've done absolutely nothing. And so you've got this blank slate, if you like. But the problem with that is if they haven't done their homework and the teaching sessions and the context. So for example, our eFast session where the lectures were delivered 5 or 6 weeks ago, they've completely forgotten it. And so then when we're starting, it's so fresh that they're not even aware of what we're looking at. And so the whole idea here of flipped classrooms, I think that's the biggest fallacy. Flipped classrooms might work at the university where they've got an exam to do, but in the real world, when there's competing challenges with just life and just having to go to work and do clinical stuff every day, the flipped classroom I found is not particularly good. And so if they haven't done that preparatory work, then the session is going to be hampered. And if your learner finds ultrasound difficult, then online is going to be even worse. And so the situation that's usually bad gets much worse simply because that online environment adds extra cognitive load and maximizes the difficulties that the learners might have. So in summary, I think that remote instruction has an amazing potential to be able to reach places where we might otherwise not go to. So for those rural and regional areas that struggle to get to the big city, or for the people to get out to the regional and remote areas, then this is an amazing tool. I think that you can't skip all those baby steps though, and you still have to go through all the same steps that you would go through in person. And just like, I don't know if anyone's heard those stories lately, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think, where, you know, there was a couple of people up in a plane, a pilot and a passenger, and the pilot has some sort of episode, and so the passenger has to radio and get someone to help him land the plane. And yes, he landed the plane successfully, but for the air traffic controller or the pilot that's sitting in air traffic control trying to instruct him down, it's much more difficult and harder. And he has to be, or that air traffic controller, he or she to be fair, has to be very, very skilled at what they're doing and really familiar with those tools and be able to task deconstruct very well for that novice passenger to be able to land the plane. And the same can be said in ultrasound. If you don't know what you're doing, and if you're not used to instructing and you haven't got good task deconstruction skills, then doing this online is very, very difficult. And so you have to be quite adept at being able to task deconstruct and articulate that very clearly so that your learner's got a hope of being able to get an image. And so I now sort of will open up, or just before I do, I want to remind everyone once more that we have the Train the Ultrasound Trainer. If you're looking to upskill your teaching skills in ultrasound, we're doing things like, how do you teach three-dimensional anatomy? How do you do task deconstruction? What's the sequence that we should be teaching ultrasound in? How do we keep our learners engaged? What sort of things do we think about for clinical supervision, and what makes better clinical supervision? So there's lots of different topics over 2 days in Melbourne in July and October. Feel free to head over to our website to check it out, and I hope to see you there. And right now I'm just going to open up to any questions from the audience. Hi,
yes,
Henry.
hello.
Hello.
Yes, using after shuttling between the session, yeah, and the presentation. But the presentation is good. I think I will have to listen to it again when you post it up on your website. I have a permission of my patient to put on the camera, and then so that you can.
It's actually a really good point here, Henry. Thank you so much.
Yes.
You can see, I don't know if anyone else can appreciate this, but you can see how, even though the screen is there and the machine is quite big for Henry, but as we're looking at it, the image that I'm looking at here is about the size of a large postage stamp, and that's how you've got to do your instruction. So it's a really nice illustration to show that it can be quite challenging, but certainly possible.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
No worries, Henry. Thanks for that. Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. I really appreciate your time tonight. I hope that there's something in amongst there that you'll find useful, and I hope to see you again next time.